line to the Key Bridge, city and state leaders have promised federal partnerships will fund state projects.
We are confident that in partnership with federal government that we're going to be able to get the project done.
But after Election Day, those partnerships are in question, along with the projects they would have funded.
Will it all get done, in the next few months, the entire $2 billion price tag? I'm not sure.
I'm going in depth on the federal funding for projects in Maryland and how a new administration could impact it. Thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mikenzie Frost. Today, we're taking a closer look at federal funding for two major projects in the state, building the Red Line and rebuilding the Key Bridge. Both projects have been major priorities and a focus for city and state leaders, and both will come with multi-billion-dollar price tags. Governor Wes Moore and Baltimore City Mayor Brandon Scott have both touted partnerships in the federal government, including Democratic Senator-elect Angela Alsobrooks as key to securing federal aid to get those projects done.
She's the perfect person to replace our great Senator Ben Cardin because she wants to continue that work. The stuff that we're doing, Mikenzie, when you think about the Highway to Nowhere, when you think about the Red Line, when you think about Frederick Douglass Tunnel and the Howard Street Tunnel and the Key Bridge, that federal investment into our group violence reduction strategy, we need our senator to be there fighting for those things, and I have no doubt that she will do that.
We are confident that in partnership with federal government that we're going to be able to get the project done.
But those promises of federal partnerships have yet to play out exactly as planned. Both the governor and the mayor campaigned for Alsobrooks, who won her Senate race. But come January, Republicans will control both chambers of Congress under the incoming Trump administration. Leaders across the state, including Governor Moore and Mayor Scott, are already expressing concern about what the next 4 years could hold for Maryland.
I don't know everything that a second Trump presidency will bring to Baltimore. But if he follows through on some of his dark, violent promises, we know that we are looking at challenges in the years ahead.
That Marylanders are worried about what this election is going to mean for themselves and their families and their future.
And if that funding doesn't come through exactly as planned, it's not clear how or if the state would pay for the Red Line or the remaining cost to rebuild the Key Bridge. Governor Moore says he's confident the federal government will pay the full cost to rebuild the bridge, adding he doesn't have a backup plan if that doesn't happen.
We're not going to need a plan B. The objective and the goal and what we will accomplish is we will get to the 100% cost share that we'll have this year. If we can get to all the guarantees that we need, we are going to be able to get the Key Bridge rebuilt faster than anyone thought possible when the tragic and deadly collapse first happened. So we don't need a plan B. Plan A will work.
Now we begin with a closer look at the Key Bridge funding and what the coming months could hold. The morning that changed the landscape for millions.
Good morning to all of you. We begin with breaking news here. Take a look at your screen.
The Francis Scott Key Bridge plunging into the frigid waters of the Patapsco River. Hours after the tragedy, President Joe Biden making remarks pledging federal support.
We're going to send all the federal resources they need as we respond to this emergency. I mean all the federal resources. And we're going to rebuild that port together.
His words kickstarting the funding question. Who would fit the bill to rebuild the bridge that's a vital part of the interstate? Maryland's congressional delegation springing into action, introducing the Baltimore Bridge Relief Act, calling to remove the 10% cost share of the rebuild, ensuring the federal government picks up the tab entirely.
It's more than just concrete and bricks and steel falling into the ocean. It has disrupted supply chains across this nation.
But so far, that movement has stalled, and fears of a collapse in funding are growing.
I've spoken to the Speaker of the House about this.
Congressman Andy Harris, Maryland's lone Republican member, says the funding is possible, but the timing is questionable.
I'm pretty sure that we are going to be able to waive the 10% state share in any rebuilding. And I'm pretty sure that ultimately it will be paid out of disaster funds of some kind. But right now, there's obviously a lot of competition for those disaster funds.
That competition stemming back from hurricanes Helene and Milton ripping through the southern part of the United States, both doing upwards of $47 billion in property damage alone.
Will it all get done, in the next few months, the entire $2 billion price tag? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure we could make a down payment on it.
But not getting it all done is not an option for Governor Westmore. The Democratic leader in his first term catapulted into the national spotlight amid the tragedy. He says federally funding the entire rebuild is the only choice, regardless of who sits in the White House or what party controls the purse strings.
We have one goal, one focus, and there's a plan A. I do not have a plan B. The plan A is making sure that we get this key bridge funding complete, because it is imperative that we have that key bridge done to make sure that the Port of Baltimore is fully functioning. The people of this state deserve it. It's the reason we've been fighting so hard, and we are going to get plan A accomplished.
Despite President Biden, Governor Moore, and others' calls for a swift congressional action, the House and Senate have stalled. Funding priorities sidelined during the lead up to the intense election cycle.
It is such an important part of the East Coast. It's not just a part of Baltimore City and Maryland. It's a part of transportation on the East Coast.
David Williams, president of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance, says he would be surprised to see President-elect Donald Trump decide not to fund the Key Bridge rebuild.
It would be really irresponsible for the administration not to make sure that this bridge is built. It would be irresponsible for Congress not to provide the funds.
But right now it's unclear if Congress will be able to make President Joe Biden's promise to the people of Maryland a reality before he leaves office and the country enters another era of the Trump administration. Now, this week, lawmakers also got a brief on the economic outlook in the state of Maryland. Budget leaders warn of a major gap in revenue projected over the next 5 years. And if a new administration in Washington does not come through with federal funds for the Key Bridge rebuild, state budget leaders say it could mean you could pay more at the toll booth.
If the federal government were not to come through with much or any funding, it would put the state would obviously bear the cost, and that's the Transportation Authority. I think it would mean toll increases sooner rather than later.
Plans for the Key Bridge rebuild are already underway, with the Maryland Transportation Authority approving a $73 million contract with a construction company to design the new bridge. The new bridge is expected to cost just under $2 billion. Officials hope to have it finished by 2028. When the bridge collapsed more than 7 months ago, President Biden promised the federal government would foot the entire bill for the rebuild. Because the Key Bridge was a federal highway, the federal government is guaranteed to fund at least 90% of the new bridge. It's that last 10% sparking the debate on Capitol Hill, a price tag of around $170 million. If Congress cannot push that funding through the next couple of months, a Republican-controlled House and Senate under President-elect Donald Trump might not pass it for the next 2 years until the midterm elections, when the balance of power in Congress could flip again. And if it stays under Republican control for 4 years, Maryland may go Trump's entire second term without seeing any more federal funding for the bridge. That could leave the state of Maryland on the hook for the last $170 million, money the state might not have, as it's currently facing $1 billion budget deficit. And another potential source of funding for the bridge, a series of lawsuits against the owners of the cargo ship, the Dolly. The groups filing lawsuits want to hold Grace Ocean Private and Synergy Marine Group responsible for footing the bill of the Key Bridge, rather only than the $43 million they've already agreed to pay right after the collapse. The parties suing include a man who survived the collapse, the families and employers of the 6 construction workers who died, the Longshoremen's Union, Baltimore City, Baltimore County, and the state of Maryland. The Dolly's owner have already agreed to pay the Justice Department more than $100 million to settle a federal lawsuit filed earlier this year. That settlement covers civil damages, and those funds will go toward the U.S. Treasury and other federal agencies involved in the disaster response. Now, this week we asked if you would be willing to pay more in taxes to pay for the Key Bridge rebuild. I want to take a look at what some of our viewers are saying. Let's take a look here. We have no, Maryland is getting too expensive for a retired person to live. Looking elsewhere, taxes is why. No, I don't even use that bridge. Why should the entire state pay more in taxes for something that only benefits a fraction of the state? Now, we know that the Key Bridge is also a vital part of the entire transportation area, so many people in the state do benefit. But another person says, why wouldn't the company that drove, I'm assuming, the ship into the bridge pay? And why would taxpayers pay the price of a foreign company's mistake?
No, there's absolutely no concern that the red line is dead.
Still to come, we're taking a closer look at funding for the Red Line, why one lawmaker is optimistic federal dollars could still fund the project. And as we head to break, let's take a look at some of today's top headlines.
Wednesday morning, while students were just starting the school day inside Milford Mill Academy. Meanwhile, outside, officers were quietly swarming the campus. According to police scanner traffic, the Regional Auto Theft Task Force spotting 2 juveniles in a stolen car sitting on school property. Around 10 a.m., they arrested 2 Milford Mill students, ages 16 and 14. The 16-year-old found with a loaded handgun in his backpack. Both were driven to a Baltimore County precinct for charging, but according to county police, only the 16-year-old was taken into custody.
We now know this week's shooting of a 15-year-old Dunbar High School student not long after dismissal started as a robbery. Baltimore police revealed that crime has spiked among juveniles, with robberies now accounting for 26% of the department's juvenile arrest cases, compared to 10% last year. During this week's public safety hearing, BPD revealed DJS had been releasing a lot of the juveniles they were arresting for robbery, and they'll now be tracking how DJS handles all juveniles their officers take to booking.
Along with the Key Bridge, the Red Line continues to be a project with serious uncertainty. With the state facing financial trouble, a new administration in Washington is just another unknown. The sounds of light rail through Baltimore could get louder if the planned 14-mile light rail Red Line project becomes a reality. The Red Line has long been rooted in politics. Former Governor Larry Hogan once canceled the project after the state received federal funding, Hogan calling the project a wasteful boondoggle, sending $900 million back to Washington.
Right, 1, 2, 3.
But in the summer of 2024, while announcing the plan was revived,
We're dreaming big. And we're getting big things done because we are getting them done together.
Governor Wes Moore made it clear success of the planned line hinged on federal support.
We are confident that in partnership with the federal government that we're going to be able to get the project done.
Those funds have yet to be realized at the federal level. Current projections put a price tag on the Red Line at more than $7 billion. Department of Transportation Director Paul Wiedefeld says the federal government could pick up half the tab, leaving the rest to the state, Baltimore City, and Baltimore County. But in Maryland, budget constraints continue to squeeze the bottom line. Maryland Department of Transportation leaders grappling with $1.3 billion in cuts in deferred projects. The Transportation Administration also facing a backlog of maintenance projects worth an estimated $500 million a year for a decade. At this point, do you believe the Red Line will ever become reality?
It probably won't, for a number of reasons.
Taxpayer watchdog David Williams says the cost of the Red Line could be the speed bump to success, but also the lack of flexibility that comes with building a light rail system.
When you build light rail or any kind of rail, you are stuck.
Williams notes it's aspirational for Governor Moore, the first-term governor looking to make a mark to revive the Red Line, especially given the transportation needs in the Baltimore region. But the election ushering in a new era in Washington, with new leaders in control of doling out the cash. Do you believe that the incoming administration would be willing to partner with leaders in the state of Maryland to ensure that something does happen when it comes to transportation in the city?
something does have to happen in Baltimore City, and that's why there needs to be some sort of pragmatism when it comes to spending money.
And finding funding in the halls of Congress could be an uphill battle, especially if the state itself can't find money to cover half the costs either.
Now, the state and city don't just rely on federal funding for big projects like the Red Line. Every year, federal grants contribute to the city's annual budget, especially when it comes to the capital budget. Unlike the city's operating budget, the capital one helps fund plans for the future, including infrastructure, renovations, and other long-term projects. The city's capital budget for fiscal year 2025 is a little more than $732 million. Around $92 million of that comes from federal grants, 12.6% of the capital budget. The city also has a projected 6-year plan to complete local infrastructure and transportation projects, and federal grants are part of the equation every year. But projections over the next 5 years are just estimates, and if federal funding dries up under the Trump administration, the city may have to look elsewhere to fund long-term projects. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are already starting to consider the future of federal funding for Maryland during Trump's second term. I sat down with Senator Chris Van Hollen to talk about what he thinks the next 4 years could look like. So, Senator Van Hollen, thank you for agreeing to give us some time today. We have a lot to talk about in terms of what an incoming Trump administration means for the state of Maryland. I want to start with the Key Bridge and the federal funding for that. What's the status on the bill as it stands right now?
Senator Cardin and I, Congressman Fume, in fact, our entire Maryland delegation on a bipartisan basis is pushing to get that last 10% authorization, and we're working to get it done by the end of the year as part of the disaster relief supplemental for the entire country or the end of the year budget process.
Do you believe that the end of the year is a realistic timeline?
I do. We are going to have a hearing in the Senate Appropriations Committee, which I serve on next week, about disaster relief funding. And so you can be sure that I will be raising the issue of the Key Bridge replacement at that time.
Are you concerned at all about the competition for the funds, given the number of disasters that we have seen unfold since the Key Bridge itself collapsed?
Well, that's right. Look, there are two issues. One is to get what we call the authorization for federal support for the full 100% refunding for the Key Bridge. As I said, we've gotten 90% locked in as a commitment. We want the other 10%. Then there's the issue of funding at the federal level for disaster relief, not just in Maryland, but around the country. Yeah. So yes, that is the other piece of this, is to replenish funds in that emergency relief program that I mentioned. So we're going to move forward on both counts.
If that doesn't happen by the end of this year, is there any concern that a new Trump administration would be less likely to authorize the federal government to fully fund the rebuild?
Well, we're going to push for it, whether we get it done this year, which of course is our preference, or next year. And again, I want to stress that the Maryland delegation on a bipartisan basis is pushing for that 100% federal relief. And that's been the precedent set in other bridge collapses around the country.
Senator Chris Van Hollen pointing to the bridge collapse in Minneapolis. The federal government there picking up 100% of the tab. The Key Bridge isn't the only funding plan up in the air, though.
Is there a concern that the Red Line is dead?
No, there's absolutely no concern that the Red Line is dead. The city of Baltimore and the state need to come up with their plan. That includes whatever new alignments we will have for the Red Line. Then the state of Maryland submits that plan to the Federal Transit Administration, which is in the Department of Transportation. And then there's a well-established process for these projects to go through. So we will continue to push through that process, but step one is for the state of Maryland to submit its plan.
And it's not just funding for the transportation projects like the Red Line or the Key Bridge. Maryland also expected to be home of the next FBI headquarters, but pushback from Republicans have some questioning if Maryland will end up being where the FBI ultimately lands.
So I want to be very clear on this point. Maryland has been selected, Greenbelt, Maryland, as the site for the future FBI headquarters. That was a decision made by the GSA, by the federal government. So we're going to continue to move full speed ahead.
Senator Van Hollen, I thank you for your time. I appreciate it. All right, after the break, with questions surrounding federal funding for a number of city and state projects, we're bringing in a political analyst to break it all down for you.
Here's tonight's primetime lineup on Fox 45. Brought to you locally by your McDonald's owner-operators.
With the future of projects like the Key Bridge and the Red Line, the FBI headquarters, it all is unclear under the Trump administration. Let's bring in an expert to help break it all down and look ahead to what the next few months and years could bring. Joining us live is Professor of Political Science, John Deedy. John, thanks for joining us. I want to start with the Red Line. We heard from U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen, who says that he believes the Red Line is not dead. He's confident. However, the funding is still uncertain. What do you think is going to happen with the Red Line?
I think he's saying what he wants to believe. Senator Steve Hershey a few days ago said the Red Line is dead, and it's deader than a doornail. It comes down to funding and money and the fact that it really hasn't been organized very well on the state level for a long time.
Now, what happens if the federal government doesn't come through and bring the funding to the table? And the state of Maryland, we know, continues to face a budget shortfall. How many years do you think the state will kick the Red Line down the road?
The Red Line will, if it ever gets done, we're talking about sometime in the 2030s, if it ever gets done, because this is a project that was talked about 20 years ago to do. So the Red Line really isn't going to go anywhere just because of the funding issue. You have a new administration, they're going to have different priorities.
Yeah. And pivoting to the Key Bridge, Senator Van Hollen says that there's a hearing next week in the Senate to talk about the funding, but we also know there's a lot of competition for these disaster dollars. Do you think Maryland will get the president's wish of 100% federal government paying for the rebuild?
I talked to someone in Dutch Ruppersberger's office today, and they said 3 words: we are worried. I called Andy Harris's office. He's the Republican representative in Maryland, and they were hemming and hawing and really didn't have an idea what was going on and really couldn't give any definite answer except we're working on it. So my optimism for the Key Bridge, I was talking to some people today, they were also talking maybe 2030. It's just these are 2 expensive projects that a Republican administration isn't going to be interested in getting involved with, and that's unfortunate.
If members of Congress representing the state of Maryland are starting to get worried, they're not even sure where things stand, is it realistic to expect this funding to get done by the end of the year?
Sometimes Congress reacts best at 5 minutes to midnight. And I could see this happening sometime shortly after Christmas. But the bigger worry for the state financially isn't these things. It's Schedule F. This is a proposal the Trump administration is going to put into place to give them more flexibility to fire federal workers. Maryland has about 7% of its workforce are federal workers. That's 135,000 people. If you cut 10% of those, that's 13,000 people out of a job. That would be a huge economic impact on the state. And also, as far as the Chesapeake Bay, the Trump administration isn't environmental friendly. So a lot of funding to help that could go away. Governor Westmore is going to face a lot of bad choices in next year's budget. And the budget after that, it's going to be a continuation of bad choices, which means bad choices sometimes mean 2 things. Cutting popular programs, he may have to look at the K through 12 stuff, and increasing taxes.
Yeah, 2 things that we know that the governor and his supporters in the democratically controlled General Assembly are not too thrilled about and looking forward to in the slightest bit. John Deedy, thank you for joining us, and I'm sure we'll continue, especially when we get to session in January about the state budget.
You're welcome.
All right, that's all for this week's edition of Fox 45 News In Depth. I'm Mikenzie Frost.